Hey YouTubers. So I thought I'd try something different. Instead of writing patch notes for a tune that I've done, I'll probably do that too. But in addition to, I guess I should say, writing patch notes for a tune, in this case it's Dulcinea, I thought I'd try to do video patch notes for the tune. And I'm pretty much just winging this. I really haven't practiced it. So we'll see how this goes. I probably should have written at least a bit of a script, but I didn't. So what are we going to do? I guess we'll just get started. So let me mute some things here. The tune is based on the Sputnik dual oscillator and Mutable Instruments Tides and Mutable Instruments Rings and Mutable Instruments Clouds. That's the main melodic thing. And then we have Tip Top 1, which is a sample player, and Peaks, kind of filling in on percussion. And the whole piece is driven by, at least melodically, the ornament in crime, and that is in what's called quatermain mode. It's basically a random quantized melody generator, for lack of a better term. If you're into this stuff, you'll be familiar with a thing called a Turing machine. I have one of those. It's in a different case. The quatermain mode kind of works like a Turing machine, except it's 4 of them. Pretty cool module. I won't go deeply into any of this. I just thought I'd do kind of an overview of sort of how the sounds work and how the composition works and that sort of thing. So that's the overview of the involved modules. There are a few other ones involved, like Pam's workout, which is a clock. I've got a random up here that I'm using. I'll get into this when I get into the Tides voice. I also have a slew up here. I have a verb, a reverb. I have a VCA here. I'll get into those as I get into the voices, I guess. So, speaking of voices, let's get into that. The tune starts out with the dual oscillator. So if I just turn this up, okay, so in the video you notice me twisting this knob. This is the timbre knob. I think this is basically a wave folder. I don't really know. I don't care. It just sounds cool. So I also have that being sort of wiggled, as we call it in the modular world, by control voltage. Control voltage that is controlling this is coming from this module here. It's called a mini slew. It's basically an envelope. The envelope is being triggered by Pam's workout, that's the clock, and I've got a certain sort of rise and fall set onto it, so it's controlling this kind of thing with each note. But as it's playing, I'm kind of changing its starting point. It almost sounds like a filter. Not quite. It's just a really nice timbre. So that's one aspect of this sound. The main oscillator's timbre is being played around with. Another thing that's being played with is the even versus odd harmonics, and I just have that on an LFO, and Peaks in this case is playing LFO, and it looks like I probably just have it in essentially a sine LFO. And it's just there kind of wiggling this knob, and this knob has this effect. It's actually pretty subtle. It's probably because it's already being wiggled by this LFO. Now the other thing that's going on in this this voice that I've got going is I'm using the dual oscillator feature, using AM from this oscillator to affect this oscillator. Gives it a slight bell-like sound if I knock it up an octave. You probably heard this in the piece. A slightly bell-like tone, almost sounds like FM, but in actuality it's AM. The AM is being affected again by CV, control voltage, the very same control voltage that's affecting the timbre. So that's just kind of being faded in on and out on each note as the note plays. Okay, so what's making this play this nice little melody? As I mentioned, it's the ornament in crime. And the ornament in crime has basically 4 channels of this quatermain thing, which is really, as I said, sort of a random quantized, meaning notes of a scale, melody generator. And by the way, I've got all of my channels of this thing are set up to be in the Mixolydian mode, which gives the song its feel. Okay, so that's what's making sort of the main, I guess, the rhythmic synth part. There's one more component to it. I use this module all the time. I actually have 2 of them in my 2 different cases. The output of the dual oscillator is being routed through veils in order to get the smooth envelope kind of thing that's going on here. But the output of veils is going into clouds. And that's what gives it the dreamy feeling. I'm pretty sure I have clouds in its normal mode. Yes, I have it in its normal granular mode. And one thing I do throughout the tune, you'll notice if you watch the video really closely, is I'll freeze clouds before doing an octave switch. And the octave switch is done over here on Ornament and Crime by selecting the channel and then clicking the up or down buttons. So that kind of lets the dual oscillator harmonize with itself to some degree. It almost acts like another voice. Okay, so now that's sort of the main driving voice to the tune. The next thing I do in the tune is I fade in the bass, which is Tides. So how am I controlling Tides? How am I making it play this bass line? Well, first off, there's no envelope. There's kind of no start or stop. It's just constantly weaving up and down. And it's doing that because I don't have an envelope on it. I'm just controlling its pitch constantly. I'm controlling its pitch with yet another channel of Ornament and Crime. That channel is being put through what's known as a slew limiter here, and that makes the notes glide from one note to the other rather than just changing instantaneously. So you can kind of hear how it slides into each note. Let me unhook the dual oscillator. So this is what Tides is doing. So remember, Ornament and Crime is randomly controlling the melody. Sometimes it doesn't actually change the note for a number of measures. But when it changes the note, you hear it sliding. I'm also controlling what are known as the shape and smoothness parameters of Tides, and I'm doing that through the very same signal essentially that I'm using to control its frequency or the tone that it's playing. And I do this, in this smaller case, I do this quite a bit. I just use the control voltage of the sequence itself to affect some of the parameters around the case. And that's because I don't necessarily have a lot of voltage control available to me in a smaller case like this. So let me get dual oscillator going again. The next thing that I fade into the tune is the percussion. So the cymbal is being played, it's getting a clock from Pam's workout, but it's going through this module. It's kind of a tricky module. It's called the 2HP 3-into-1. It's basically a voltage controlled switch. You can feed multiple signals into it and have it select one of those signals at a time by sending it control voltage, and it kind of rotates amongst those three inputs and sends them to one output. Short way of saying it is, it causes the clocks coming out of it to not be 100% consistent. So you can hear how it pauses and starts up again. This is something I do a lot, whether it's with this module or other modules. I tend to try to make the cymbals or the higher pitched things oftentimes have them be pretty dynamic, and I think it adds interest to the tune. I'll also put them in sort of on different counts, and that kind of helps as well. So in this case, the thing that's actually modulating the switch is actually the random output of this random and clock module, this 1 unit module up here. And that's causing it to kind of bounce around quickly. I don't know if you'll be able to see that on the video. It's actually bouncing around more quickly than the clock signal itself. It doesn't really matter. I'm getting the randomness I want in the cymbal sound. The cymbal is being routed through this effect unit up here. It's called a digitank or digiverb. It's another 1 unit module from IntelliGel. And it's not a particularly good sounding effect. It's kind of weird, but I like to use that weirdness to give a little texture, especially to higher pitched percussive elements. So I use it quite a bit on the hi-hat type sounds. Okay, so that's it for the percussion. Kind of the star of the show, and that's often the case in tunes that I do with this case. Rings comes into play. This is a mutable instruments module. It's super popular. A lot of videos on YouTube feature it. A lot of mine feature it. And that's because it sounds really beautiful. It's got a lot of modes. It's got some polyphony, or the effect of polyphony. So notes can play over one another. It can kind of play chords. It sounds like a guitar, or like an organ, or like a steel guitar, or you name it. It's got this capability, even percussion really, this capability to be all sorts of things. It doesn't sound like anything else, but it sounds a lot like rings. So eventually what I do is I fade this guy in. Let me get it into its normal position here, or the starting position. So rings is kind of interesting. You can have rings play without even sending it a clock or a trigger. All you have to send it is a voltage that represents the note it should play, and when the notes change, it triggers itself. So that's what I'm doing here. I've got another channel of Ornament and Crime coming out into rings. And then, crazily enough, remember I said sometimes I use my sequence control voltage to actually control parameters on modules. So in this case, I'm using the control voltage that's giving us our melody to also wiggle or modulate the brightness, damping, and position parameters of rings. That means as the pitch goes up, because the volt per octave voltage goes up, these controls will also be kind of moved up virtually. What voltage control does in these situations is like remote controls knobs. So just throw that in. This isn't really a tutorial on how these synths work, but that's essentially what's going on. We have voltages going through the system, and things that I could do with my fingers can actually be done with voltages. All right, so back to rings. One of the cool features of rings is it's got different modes, and the mode I have it in right now is called Western chords. It's basically playing arpeggiated chords. And I use this along with this control called structure to create some movement in the song. What you'll find is there are only a few sweet spots based on a given mode you're in or scale you're in when you're in this mode, so you have to experiment a bit, and I had already experimented with this before I recorded the tune, and I've experimented with it a lot in other tunes. So at some point, as the tune moves along, I make the decision, I'm listening to the bass notes, and I'm waiting for a change. And I switch the structure control to the next good sounding position for the mode that I'm in and the tuning basically that we're in. And I start fooling around. Even though these parameters are being affected by the control voltage from the sequence, I'm also manually wiggling them. So this damping and position control, if you start increasing those, it starts sounding more and more like a steel guitar. And when I have it in this mode, I tend to flick the structure knob to kind of create bends. There's what's called a resonator as part of this circuit, and even doing that bend sort of causes the resonator to react and draws the notes out. So that's another reason I do it. It doesn't always sound good. You gotta bend it to the right place, just like on a guitar. One more position sounds decent. If you want to see me go nuts with this control, check out my video. It's one of the first ones, or the first one I did with this case, Lords of the West, and it pretty much features rings, and there's another mutable elements module that I had in the case at the time, elements. Those two modules, a little bit of percussion, and I really just went nuts playing with the structure control on rings. I do it fairly often, as I said. So I basically was playing around with this stuff, but then we've got the kind of, whatever you want to call it, the bridge, the break, whatever in the middle of the tune, where I want to switch it into a different feel. To do that, you can't, even though I said you don't have to send rings triggers in order to get it to play notes, you can send it triggers, and that's into this thing called strum, which you probably can't see. So you can tell if you watch closely in the video, about midway through, I plug this cable in and I unplug this. So now what I'm doing is I'm strumming, and by unplugging my volt per octave, it's basically playing the same note over and over. And then I push damping and position all the way over. So it basically just plays this long legato note. And again, I use the structure control to change the note that's playing. And so once I've done that for a while, I fade it out and then go back into regular rings mode, where it plays notes when it gets different note values. So I think that pretty much covers how this patch works. I don't think I've left anything extremely interesting out. That's kind of the overall feel. Oh, okay. I did miss the bass. There's a bass sound. If I turn these off, there's that kind of bass drum sound, or whatever you want to call it. It's probably not the same one that's in the video on YouTube, as a matter of fact, because anytime I turn off my case, the Tip Top 1 forgets where it was, and there's like 256 samples on here, so I have to go spinning around looking for it. I usually just end up on the one that sounds reasonable at the time. So that's one more component I forgot to talk about when I was talking about percussion. So I think that kind of covers it. In terms of getting this thing recorded, what I do, basically I always go directly into a digital recorder. I don't take it into a computer and do any further mixing or anything. So all of my sound sources are being routed into this mixer. This is an IntelliGel mix-up. This is a pretty new module. It's kind of a mix of stereo and mono. It's got a couple of stereo channels. I use stereo a lot because Mutable's modules, rings, and elements tend to be stereo. And then this reverb I'm using here, it's stereo. So I like to have a couple of stereo channels in my mixer. And this mix-up module also has a couple of mono channels. They aren't panable, so they're just centered. And then the stereo channels are just hard panned left and right. This is a pretty flexible module for a real simple mixer that lets you do a bit of stereo and a bit of mono. And then I have that coming out into this micro jack, and this is another IntelliGel module. So the outputs of that are just going into the micro jack. That's going out into a splitter. The splitter, hopefully I'm not killing my audio right now. I got a little bit of a short. One channel is going to my headphones. The other channel goes to my digital recorder, which is recording the audio of this right this moment. Sorry, the musical audio. And I just do my performance. And I do it as many times as I have to get it right with the video camera rolling. So I think I've covered pretty much everything. I mix it all together at the end in my iMovie. I just use iMovie. I just edit everything together and upload it to YouTube, and I'm done. So that's it. I know this wasn't very sort of organized, but I thought I'd just go ahead and do it while I had the energy to do it. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned. See ya.